Hello everyone, I'm Ronnie and welcome back to American Christianity. I'm so glad you've chosen to join us for episode 3. We've already traveled through the early religious experiments that shaped the English colonies in previous episodes, and now we're going to dig even deeper into a critical aspect that influenced American religious life from its earliest days: the presence of multiple faith traditions living side by side, often uncomfortably, under the banner of colonial rule. Before we dive in, I'd like to remind you that if you enjoy these explorations into the religious history of early America, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or questions. Your engagement is what allows our community to grow, learn, and keep this conversation going. Every like, subscribe, and comment helps ensure that we can continue creating comprehensive content that brings the past to life. Now let's set the stage for what we're about to discuss. When we think of colonial America's religious landscape, it's easy to picture a time when one or two dominant Christian traditions defined life in each colony. For example, we've already examined the Puritans of New England and the Anglicans of Virginia. However, such a vision, while partially accurate, is incomplete. From the very beginning, the American colonies were far more religiously pluralistic than we often realize. Quakers, Catholics, Jews, Huguenots, Mennonites, and a host of smaller sects and denominations made their way across the Atlantic, sometimes willingly and sometimes under duress, bringing their own religious practices, theological convictions, and cultural traditions to the New World. These religious outsiders did not arrive into a social vacuum. Their presence challenged the dominant churches and civil authorities to consider how to respond to these others, people who did not neatly fit into the reigning religious systems. Over time, this patchwork of beliefs, devotions, and worship styles forced the colonies to grapple with the problem of difference. How should we treat these communities? Should the law enforce religious conformity or allow some degree of freedom? If we allow freedom, then how much is too much? And where do we draw the line? In this episode, we'll explore how some groups manage to carve out spaces of relative tolerance and acceptance. The Quakers in Pennsylvania, for instance, are a prime example. Inspired by William Penn's Holy Experiment, they sought to create a colony where religious liberty was not merely an afterthought, but a guiding principle. Catholics, despite facing significant anti-Catholic sentiment due to English Protestant suspicions, found a haven in Maryland, at least initially, shaping early experiments in religious toleration. And beyond these larger stories, we have the many smaller religious communities whose quiet persistence and faithfulness contributed to the evolving notion of religious freedom that would become so central to the American identity. So join me as we journey into the world of colonial religious diversity. We'll meet new faces, revisit familiar names, and try to understand how the lived reality of multiple faith traditions, interacting and sometimes clashing in this new environment, planted the seeds for the religious freedom we often celebrate today. By the middle of the 17th century, the religious tapestry in the American colonies had begun to shift and expand beyond the familiar patterns established by the earliest English settlers. In the first decades of colonization, religious life had seemed more straightforward, each region dominated by a leading tradition that shaped community values and governance. New England Puritanism, for instance, tended to hold fast to a vision of a covenanted society guided by strict moral order and conformity. Virginia and the Chesapeake region, though never as uniform in religious practice as the Puritan colonies, leaned heavily toward the Church of England, reflecting the ties that planters and gentry maintained with the mother country. However, as the colonies matured and the Atlantic world became more interconnected, the door gradually opened to a broad range of religious groups. Some arrived seeking a safe haven, others came as part of economic or political ventures. Whatever their reasons, by the late 17th and into the 18th century, an unprecedented pluralism had begun to shape daily life in the colonies. This was a time when religious diversity became a lived reality rather than a distant theory. Men and women of differing creeds, theological inclinations, and devotional practices found themselves not only living in close proximity, but engaging with one another as neighbors, trading partners, and at times fellow colonists united by pragmatic concerns. The Middle Colonies in particular emerged as spaces where the boundaries between different Christian denominations began to blur. German Lutherans and Reformed Christians, Scottish and Irish Presbyterians, English Quakers, Dutch Reformed communities, French Huguenots, and even a small but enduring population of Jews all contributed to a religious milieu that was significantly more varied than what one would have found in the earliest days of settlement. Towns and cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and the communities along the Delaware and Hudson rivers became microcosms of this developing pluralism, where houses of worship representing multiple traditions sometimes stood in the same neighborhoods. In these diverse colonial environments, faith was not simply a private matter. Religious identity still carried profound social, cultural, and political weight. Yet the constant presence of religious others challenged older assumptions about what it meant to be a unified Christian colony. Communities that had hoped to maintain tight religious uniformity found that, as populations grew and economies expanded, they could not easily prevent the arrival of new groups with their own distinct beliefs and liturgical styles. The presence of so many different denominations raised pressing questions. Should these varied traditions be tolerated or restricted? Were all Christian groups entitled to the same freedoms, or did some deserve a privileged status due to their numbers, political influence, or historical precedent? How could a society maintain moral order if not everyone worshipped in the same way? Yet even as these questions sparked tension and debate, they also prompted a gradual recalibration of what religious life could mean in the colonies. Over time, colonists began to move away from the assumption that religious uniformity was the only path toward moral or social cohesion. Certain colonies, though not all, embraced more tolerant policies, granting limited rights and protections to a variety of Christian groups. In Pennsylvania, for example, the Quaker experiment in religious liberty provided a powerful example of how a colony could thrive without imposing a single religious doctrine on its inhabitants. Maryland's early years, too, had demonstrated that it was possible, at least for a time, for Catholics and Protestants to coexist under a framework that promised some degree of religious tolerance. Not all colonies advanced toward pluralism at the same pace or in the same spirit. In some places, suspicion and hostility persisted well into the 18th century. Laws were passed to limit the public expression of certain faiths, and entrenched elites still looked askance at the newcomers who dotted the religious landscape. Dissenting groups continued to face hardships, including social ostracism, fines, and occasional violence. Nevertheless, by the early 18th century, religious diversity was no longer an anomaly in the colonies. Instead, it had become a defining characteristic of the American religious scene, a feature that distinguished life in the New World from the more homogeneous regions of Europe. This multiplicity of faiths did not guarantee instant harmony, of course. Far from it. Yet the fact that so many distinct groups lived in relative proximity, interacting in markets, courts, and shared public spaces, meant that tolerance, however grudging or incomplete, became a practical necessity. Over time, the presence of multiple denominations would gradually work its way into the colonial consciousness, influencing the nascent ideals that would later emerge more clearly in the founding era. Even before those enlightened pronouncements of religious liberty were codified into law, the colonies had begun to lay the social groundwork for a more inclusive, if still contested, understanding of what it meant to live in a religiously plural society. The Quakers emerged in 17th century England as a radical departure from the religious norms of their time, challenging the established church's hierarchy, rights, and external authority. They insisted that genuine faith sprang from the inner light of God present in every individual, regardless of social rank, gender, or formal education. This conviction, radical in its egalitarian implications, translated directly into how Quakers practiced their faith. Instead of elaborate ceremonies or ordained clergy, they gathered quietly, waiting for the Spirit to move them. Their simplicity of worship, their plain speech, their refusal to swear oaths or bear arms, all made them conspicuous dissenters in societies accustomed to religious uniformity and deference to authority. When Quakers began arriving in the American colonies, they carried with them not only their unconventional religious practices, but also a set of principles that would come to influence the broader religious culture of the New World. They arrived as outsiders. In Massachusetts, for instance, Puritan leaders regarded them as dangerous heretics. The Quakers' refusal to adhere to established church forms, their insistence on religious freedom, and their sometimes provocative demonstrations of conscience brought them into immediate conflict with the colony's leadership. They were jailed, fined, and in some extreme cases, executed. Such harsh treatment, however, only strengthened the Quakers' resolve to find a place where they could model a different way of religious life, one that relied not on legal enforcement and conformity, but on the freedom of individual conscience. It is in this search for a haven that William Penn's Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania comes to the fore. Penn, a prominent Quaker converted in his youth, envisioned a colony where religious liberty would be genuine, sustained not by royal edict or reluctant toleration, but by the guiding moral principles of its inhabitants. When King Charles II granted Penn the charter for Pennsylvania in 1681, Penn seized the opportunity to apply Quaker ideals to the governance of a colony. Here he promised people of all faiths, and even those of no faith, could live together without fear of persecution. He called on immigrants from various backgrounds, inviting them to settle on the fertile lands along the Delaware River and build communities grounded in fairness, peace, and mutual respect. The Quaker notion of religious tolerance did not arise from a passive indifference to doctrinal differences. Rather, it was an active commitment to the belief that no single human institution could claim a monopoly on divine truth. Because they trusted the workings of the inner light in all individuals, they saw no legitimate reason to coerce faith. While they did not consider all religious ideas equally correct, their method of persuasion was gentle, grounded in example and reason, never enforced by legal compulsion. The government of Pennsylvania reflected these attitudes. Freed from the dictates of a state church, inhabitants were not required to attend any particular service or pay taxes to maintain a favored denomination. Though not every Quaker official perfectly embodied these lofty principles, the colony's legal framework made it clear that religious persecution would have no place there. As a result, Pennsylvania became a magnet for religious minorities. Lutherans, Presbyterians, Anabaptists, Moravians, and even Jews found in Pennsylvania a level of safety and opportunity unmatched in many other colonies. This diversity, assembled under the watchful, if humble, gaze of Quaker influence, taught colonists that a multitude of faiths could coexist without social collapse. The colony's economic growth and relative peace stood as living proof that religious differences need not be policed harshly in order to ensure prosperity and order. Commerce, agriculture, and artisanal crafts thrived, communities cooperated on civic projects, and though friction naturally arose, the absence of a legally favored church made it harder to justify crushing dissent. This new environment did not mean that prejudice vanished overnight. Quakers themselves were not immune to human failings, and religious minorities still encountered suspicion. Yet the foundation that Penn and his Quaker brethren laid was one in which the guiding principle was the freedom of conscience. They set an example other colonies could consider when rethinking their own religious policies. Even those who initially saw the Quaker experiment with skepticism could not ignore the fact that Pennsylvania's social fabric, woven from many religious traditions, held firm. In time, as the 18th century progressed, the Quaker influence subtly shaped colonial conversations about rights, governance, and the role of religion in public life. The Quakers were not the sole architects of religious liberty, but their firm insistence that faith must be free helped nurture a climate in which tolerance could blossom. By embodying a principled stance against coercion and religious uniformity, they introduced a notion that would later resonate in the wider American struggle for freedom of thought, speech, and belief. Through their presence, their example, and their moral suasion, the Quakers moved the colonies closer to embracing a broader, more humane vision of religious life. Catholics occupied a complex and often precarious position in the religious tapestry of the American colonies. Arriving as part of the great movements of Europeans seeking new starts in the New World, they carried with them traditions that were, in many ways, at odds with the Protestant ethos that dominated English colonial life. More than a theological difference or a matter of elaborate ritual versus austere simplicity, Catholicism evoked fears and suspicions rooted in centuries of conflict between Protestant and Catholic powers in Europe. Memories of the Reformation, the bloody turmoil in England, and the uneasy peace that followed cast long shadows across the Atlantic. For many English colonists, the word Catholic conjured images of foreign rule, secret alliances, papal interference, and a church hierarchy that seemed dangerously authoritarian. Within this climate, Catholics struggled to find a foothold. In most colonies, established churches discouraged or outright banned Catholic worship. Penalties, subtle and overt, reminded Catholics that they were outsiders, their loyalties deemed uncertain. Yet even in these harsh conditions, Catholics did manage to carve out a place for themselves, at least for a time. Nowhere was this more evident than in Maryland, a colony that began as an experiment in religious tolerance launched under the leadership of the Calvert family. The Calverts, themselves Catholic, had envisioned their proprietary colony as a refuge where followers of the old faith could live alongside Protestants without fear of persecution. In an age when few dared to imagine anything other than a Protestant-dominated Atlantic, Maryland's founding charter hinted at a world where Catholics might stand on equal footing with their Protestant neighbors. For a while, Maryland offered hope that such a vision could endure. The famous Toleration Act of 1649 provided a legal framework that guaranteed freedom of worship to Trinitarian Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant. Although this act did not emerge solely from enlightened goodwill, it was partly pragmatic, as the Catholic minority needed to placate Protestant settlers. It nevertheless set an important precedent. In its early decades, Maryland's unusual balance of power allowed Catholics to worship more openly than in almost any other English colony. They built chapels, founded communities, and participated in the social and economic fabric of the colony. Their priests, though often cautious, moved about with relative freedom, ministering to congregations that had few other places on this side of the Atlantic to practice their faith in peace. This delicate equilibrium could not last indefinitely. The tensions that simmered beneath the surface of English politics, fueled by religious rivalries back in Europe, soon boiled over. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which enthroned Protestant monarchs in England and crushed any remaining hopes of a Catholic ascendancy there, also reverberated in the colonies. In Maryland, suspicion towards Catholics grew stronger as the mother country hardened its stance against what it regarded as a pernicious religious minority. Colonists who had once lived alongside Catholics with relative calm began to worry that their Catholic neighbors might harbor clandestine political ambitions or secret allegiances to France or Spain. Slowly but unmistakably, Maryland's unique climate of toleration receded, giving way to a more familiar pattern of Protestant dominance. By the early 18th century, Catholics found themselves increasingly marginalized once again. Laws restricted their civil liberties, limiting their ability to hold public office or influence government. They were sometimes forced to pay taxes to support Protestant churches, a practice that further confirmed their reduced status. Whispers of intrigue and conspiracy remained a persistent burden, though the violence and cruelty that Catholics had faced in early Massachusetts did not become the norm throughout the colonies. Prejudice against them was a steady, dull presence. They were tolerated as long as they kept quiet and tended to their own affairs, but the idealism of Maryland's early years had vanished. Only in the shadows, on private estates or secluded chapels, did they find the space to maintain their religious traditions. Yet even as Catholics encountered these challenges, their presence was not without a subtle impact on the broader religious conversation unfolding in the colonies. By their very existence, Catholics forced other colonists to consider the boundaries of religious freedom. What did it mean to have a religious minority whose theology and practices appeared so starkly different from those of the Protestant mainstream? Was it possible that the political stability and economic prosperity of the colonies could be maintained even if Catholics were granted a measure of liberty and respect? Over time, as the colonies drifted closer to a sense of shared identity and the Revolutionary era approached, these questions would matter more and more. Although Catholics remained a small and often mistrusted minority, the experience of encountering them, in Maryland and elsewhere, helped shape the developing idea that religious life in America could not be narrowly defined, that the future might hold room for believers of all stripes, and that the tension between suspicion and freedom would eventually give way, in fits and starts, to something more inclusive. In the end, Catholics' role in the colonies was both marginal and transformative. They never dominated religious life, nor did they escape the prejudice and social barriers that hemmed them in. Yet their mere presence, their quiet persistence, and the early Maryland experiment in tolerance planted seeds of thought that would grow in the coming decades. As the colonies moved toward independence and the notion of religious freedom gained traction, the memory of Catholics living, worshiping, and surviving within these Protestant-dominated communities provided a subtle but real example that difference need not lead inevitably to persecution. Catholics occupied a complex and often precarious position in the religious tapestry of the American colonies. Arriving as part of the great movements of Europeans seeking new starts in the New World, they carried with them traditions that were, in many ways, at odds with the Protestant ethos that dominated English colonial life. More than a theological difference or a matter of elaborate ritual versus austere simplicity, Catholicism evoked fears and suspicions rooted in centuries of conflict between Protestant and Catholic powers in Europe. Memories of the Reformation, the bloody turmoil in England, and the uneasy peace that followed cast long shadows across the Atlantic. For many English colonists, the word Catholic conjured images of foreign rule, secret alliances, papal interference, and a church hierarchy that seemed dangerously authoritarian. Within this climate, Catholics struggled to find a foothold. In most colonies, established churches discouraged or outright banned Catholic worship. Penalties, subtle and overt, reminded Catholics that they were outsiders, their loyalties deemed uncertain. Yet even in these harsh conditions, Catholics did manage to carve out a place for themselves, at least for a time. Nowhere was this more evident than in Maryland, a colony that began as an experiment in religious tolerance launched under the leadership of the Calvert family. The Calverts, themselves Catholic, had envisioned their proprietary colony as a refuge where followers of the old faith could live alongside Protestants without fear of persecution. In an age when few dared to imagine anything other than a Protestant-dominated Atlantic, Maryland's founding charter hinted at a world where Catholics might stand on equal footing with their Protestant neighbors. For a while, Maryland offered hope that such a vision could endure. The famous Toleration Act of 1649 provided a legal framework that guaranteed freedom of worship to Trinitarian Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant. Although this act did not emerge solely from enlightened goodwill, it was partly pragmatic, as the Catholic minority needed to placate Protestant settlers. It nevertheless set an important precedent. In its early decades, Maryland's unusual balance of power allowed Catholics to worship more openly than in almost any other English colony. They built chapels, founded communities, and participated in the social and economic fabric of the colony. Their priests, though often cautious, moved about with relative freedom, ministering to congregations that had few other places on this side of the Atlantic to practice their faith in peace. This delicate equilibrium could not last indefinitely. The tensions that simmered beneath the surface of English politics, fueled by religious rivalries back in Europe, soon boiled over. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which enthroned Protestant monarchs in England and crushed any remaining hopes of a Catholic ascendancy there, also reverberated in the colonies. In Maryland, suspicion towards Catholics grew stronger as the mother country hardened its stance against what it regarded as a pernicious religious minority. Colonists who had once lived alongside Catholics with relative calm began to worry that their Catholic neighbors might harbor clandestine political ambitions or secret allegiances to France or Spain. Slowly but unmistakably, Maryland's unique climate of toleration receded, giving way to a more familiar pattern of Protestant dominance. By the early 18th century, Catholics found themselves increasingly marginalized once again. Laws restricted their civil liberties, limiting their ability to hold public office or influence government. They were sometimes forced to pay taxes to support Protestant churches, a practice that further confirmed their reduced status. Whispers of intrigue and conspiracy remained a persistent burden, though the violence and cruelty that Catholics had faced in early Massachusetts did not become the norm throughout the colonies. Prejudice against them was a steady, dull presence. They were tolerated as long as they kept quiet and tended to their own affairs, but the idealism of Maryland's early years had vanished. Only in the shadows, on private estates or secluded chapels, did they find the space to maintain their religious traditions. Yet even as Catholics encountered these challenges, their presence was not without a subtle impact on the broader religious conversation unfolding in the colonies. By their very existence, Catholics forced other colonists to consider the boundaries of religious freedom. What did it mean to have a religious minority whose theology and practices appeared so starkly different from those of the Protestant mainstream? Was it possible that the political stability and economic prosperity of the colonies could be maintained even if Catholics were granted a measure of liberty and respect? Over time, as the colonies drifted closer to a sense of shared identity and the Revolutionary era approached, these questions would matter more and more. Although Catholics remained a small and often mistrusted minority, the experience of encountering them, in Maryland and elsewhere, helped shape the developing idea that religious life in America could not be narrowly defined, that the future might hold room for believers of all stripes, and that the tension between suspicion and freedom would eventually give way, in fits and starts, to something more inclusive. In the end, Catholics' role in the colonies was both marginal and transformative. They never dominated religious life, nor did they escape the prejudice and social barriers that hemmed them in. Yet their mere presence, their quiet persistence, and the early Maryland experiment in tolerance planted seeds of thought that would grow in the coming decades. As the colonies moved toward independence and the notion of religious freedom gained traction, the memory of Catholics living, worshiping, and surviving within these Protestant-dominated communities provided a subtle but real example that difference need not lead inevitably to persecution. Over the decades that bridged the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the American colonies were not only changing demographically and religiously, but also intellectually and legally. These changes flowed not from any single source or event, but emerged from an evolving conversation that spanned the Atlantic world. As trade and correspondence linked the colonies with European cultural centers, new philosophies and legal doctrines mingled with older religious traditions. Colonial thinkers, merchants, ministers, and magistrates began to imagine the boundaries of faith and governance in ways that diverged from the entrenched positions of the past. Gradually, this intellectual ferment would help lay the foundations for a more systematic understanding of religious freedom. At the heart of this shift were ideas circulating among enlightened thinkers in Europe. Although the Enlightenment was far from uniform and its adherents disagreed on many issues, a shared suspicion of absolute authority and a growing reverence for reason, experience, and moral inquiry began to seep into colonial minds. The colonists could not easily ignore the debates raging across the Atlantic about the nature of human rights, the proper limits of government, and the value of toleration as opposed to coercion. Works by John Locke, for instance, crossed the ocean and were read or discussed by the more educated elites who congregated in port towns and in the fledgling institutions of learning that the colonies were beginning to establish. Locke's arguments that government existed to protect life, liberty, and property, rather than to enforce uniform religious beliefs, found a receptive if cautious audience in a land where diverse faiths already rubbed shoulders every day. The intellectual climate created by these philosophical imports did not remain sealed in private studies or exclusive salons. Rather, it subtly influenced colonial lawmaking, judicial decisions, and even sermons from the pulpit. Religious leaders who once might have supported a state-enforced orthodoxy began to see that such measures could have unintended consequences, potentially undermining the credibility of the faith they aimed to protect. The very process of governing religiously diverse communities nudged magistrates and governors toward policies that, if not fully pluralistic, at least recognized a difference between spiritual matters and civil authority. Colonial charters, local laws, and court rulings started to reflect a more flexible attitude, even if these concessions were sometimes minimal or begrudging. A key dimension of this evolution lay in the realization that no single religious group, not even the long-established denominations, could reliably count on permanent ascendancy. As the colonies grew in population and complexity, religious competition introduced a new dynamic. Once it became clear that no faction would achieve undisputed dominance, leaders at various levels of government began to see a practical imperative for tolerance. This was not always a high-minded commitment to principle, but rather a recognition that social peace depended on giving groups enough religious space to live with their differences. Over time, pragmatic accommodations hardened into precedents. Local courts, for example, would sometimes rule in favor of religious minorities, or at least refrain from punishing them too severely, thereby establishing small but significant legal footholds that future generations would build upon. Enlightenment thought and evolving legal practice also converged in the realm of print culture. Newspapers and pamphlets, increasingly common in the colonies by the early 18th century, shared reports of religious controversies and debates. Citizens who read these stories encountered arguments that challenged old assumptions and proposed new standards for judging the proper relationship between church and state. Since public opinion in the colonies was shaped by these printed discussions, the legal environment reflected not just top-down authority, but also a bottom-up ferment, as readers formed their own views on how far religious toleration should extend. In this shifting intellectual and legal context, it was easier for radical ideas to gain a hearing, if not always acceptance. Voices emerged defending the conscience as a sacred domain, beyond the rightful reach of government. Ministers who once might have been suspicious of dissenters began to argue that genuine faith could only emerge without compulsion. Lawyers and philosophers questioned the legal standing of religious tests for office, wondering if barring a qualified man from serving in public life solely because of his creed was not only unfair, but ultimately detrimental to good governance. Over time, these voices multiplied, sometimes contradicting one another, yet cumulatively making it harder to justify the old frameworks of strict religious uniformity. By the mid-18th century, none of these intellectual and legal developments had yet crystallized into a full-fledged doctrine of religious freedom, as modern Americans might recognize it. The colonies remained places where religious prejudices persisted. Certain denominations enjoyed de facto advantages, and the idea of separating church and state was still a distant and contested notion. Yet the threads were being spun and woven together. Colonial legislatures that refrained from punishing minority sects, courts that upheld certain principles of fairness, pamphleteers who spread the gospel of toleration, and theologians who discovered spiritual freedom in the absence of state coercion, all contributed to the growing conviction that diversity need not be suppressed. In these decades, the intellectual and legal groundwork was laid, however haphazardly, for a future in which religious liberty would be embraced not simply as a begrudging concession, but as an ideal rooted in both reason and justice. If the story of religious pluralism in the colonies was one of gradual accommodation and uneasy coexistence, it was also a story marked by resistance, backlash, and open conflict. Not everyone welcomed the influx of new congregations or the loosening of religious controls. Many, fearing that pluralism would undermine social stability and moral order, fought strenuously to defend the old ways. Their opposition was not merely theoretical. Sometimes it was encoded in the law, with fines, oaths, and property restrictions that pressured dissenters to conform. At other moments, resistance took a more violent turn, as angry mobs harassed, threatened, or assaulted those considered heretical or dangerous. The path to broader religious liberty would not be straight. It was carved through episodes of struggle that pitted neighbor against neighbor and sometimes colonist against crown. In places like Massachusetts Bay, early confrontations with Quakers had already revealed how deeply entrenched certain communities were in their vision of a pure, unified faith. The sight of Quakers preaching in public squares or refusing to doff their hats in courtrooms struck the Puritan leadership as an intolerable affront to communal discipline. Conflicts escalated beyond shouted insults and public shaming. Quakers were whipped, imprisoned, and in rare cases, executed. Such violence did not vanish overnight as the colonies evolved. Instead, it smoldered, sometimes re-emerging at moments of heightened tension. In other colonies, Protestants who feared Catholic influence or power staged riots, tearing down chapels and driving clergy underground. Violence of this kind was far from universal, but its occurrence exposed the fragility of any system that tried to contain deep-seated religious animosities. Beneath physical altercations lay a simmering anxiety. To many colonists, religious uniformity was synonymous with political order. Could a society hold together if its members did not agree on fundamental matters of faith? The legacy of Europe's religious wars weighed heavily on their minds, cautioning them against unchecked tolerance. Faced with growing diversity, some colonists turned to legal measures to reaffirm an established church. They passed laws to restrict voting rights to members of a single denomination, imposed religious tests for public office, or required attendance at approved religious services. The threat of legal penalties, including fines and imprisonment, was used to corral reluctant sects back into the fold. These measures rarely succeeded in eradicating dissent, but they placed real hardships on minority believers, making it difficult for them to earn a living, own property, or participate in public life. Resistance did not always flow in one direction. Religious minorities could also push back against restrictions and harassment, waging a kind of quiet warfare of endurance. They formed close-knit communities, pooling resources to pay the fines levied against them, sheltering their ministers when authorities tried to expel them, and smuggling religious literature into colonies that outlawed certain texts. Although these acts of defiance often went unnoticed by the wider public, they amounted to an enduring refusal to submit entirely. By persistently re-establishing themselves and their ways of worship, minority groups forced the dominant communities to confront the reality that suppression was costly and could even backfire. As the 18th century unfolded, the intellectual currents discussed earlier also played into the patterns of resistance and conflict. Those influenced by Enlightenment ideas and a growing sense that forced conformity was counterproductive began to question whether brutal methods could truly protect society. If a faith needed violence and legal compulsion to survive, what did that say about its inherent strength? Colonial leaders and ordinary citizens alike pondered these questions, sometimes in taverns and coffee houses where heated debates raged late into the night. Though not all were convinced, such conversations chipped away at the old certainties that faith and force must be intertwined. The struggle over religious boundaries was, in this sense, both moral and strategic. Colonists weighed the costs of continuing to police belief. They asked themselves what was gained by preventing Quakers, Catholics, Jews, or German pietists from practicing their rituals. The conflicts and confrontations, painful as they were, became catalysts for rethinking the entire premise of religious governance. Every act of brutality invited questions about justice and decency. Every attempt to legislate belief inspired counter-arguments that faith, if genuine, required the free assent of the soul. Over time, these reflections made it harder to justify old patterns of coercion. They also suggested that, while conflict was inevitable in a world of diverse beliefs, the best solution might lie not in stamping out dissent, but in learning to live with it. Thus, the chapters of resistance and conflict were not merely regrettable footnotes. They were pivotal to the evolution of religious tolerance. Fear and hostility exposed the limits of a system that tried to maintain unity by force. Cruel punishments and legal restrictions revealed themselves as unsustainable strategies as populations diversified and intellectual horizons broadened. The very struggles that pitted colonists against each other became part of the long, twisting road toward understanding that religious difference, properly managed, could be more of a strength than a liability. It was through wrestling with these conflicts, enduring painful episodes, and questioning long-held assumptions that the colonies inched closer to embracing a broader conception of religious freedom. As the 18th century drew on, the colonies found themselves on a slow yet discernible trajectory toward a break with the mother country. The stirrings of discontent that would eventually culminate in the American Revolution were not simply political or economic. Behind the more obvious grievances, the rising tax burdens, the intrusive presence of British troops, and the restricting trade regulations, there lay deeper cultural currents, including the evolving religious climate that had been centuries in the making. Religious pluralism and the gradual acceptance of multiple faiths played a subtle but important role in preparing the colonial mind for the idea that human beings should determine their own destiny rather than submit to unyielding external authority. This was not to say that religion lost its power. On the contrary, the Great Awakening and other revival movements inflamed the religious imagination. Ministers traveled from colony to colony, preaching a message of personal conversion and spiritual equality before God, a radical departure from the older assumption that spiritual authority was best left in the hands of an educated, state-sanctioned clergy. These revivals encouraged colonists to think of faith as an intensely personal experience, open to all, and answerable to no earthly king. Although the awakenings did not preach revolution directly, they fostered habits of thought that undermined the notion of unquestioned obedience. If an individual could break from the prescribed religious forms and seek God directly, why not also challenge the political forms imposed from overseas? Simultaneously, the intellectual legacy of the Enlightenment continued to mingle with religious life. Colonial printers circulated treatises on liberty, natural rights, and the moral obligations of government. As colonists read these works, they absorbed the idea that authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, ought to be justified by reason and consent. In an environment where different religious congregations had long struggled to live together, the lesson was that tolerance and cooperation could exist even without a uniform creed. This lesson carried over into political thought. If a diverse people could find ways to coexist in faith, might they not also stand together in asserting rights against a distant power that failed to recognize their full humanity and aspirations? By the 1760s and 1770s, resentment against British policies intensified. Colonial leaders drew upon a language that blended political, religious, and moral themes. Appeals to the rights of Englishmen, mixed with references to divine justice, human dignity, and the sanctity of conscience. Those who had grown accustomed to attending a variety of churches, observing multiple denominations celebrating their faith in public or private, and hearing spirited debates over doctrine, were now also attending political gatherings where speech flowed freely and the boundaries of acceptable opinion were widening. Just as religious diversity had taught colonists that uniformity was not the only path to order, these political assemblies taught them that unity could arise from shared principles rather than from a mandated conformity. In this sense, religious pluralism had done quiet preparatory work for the coming revolution. It had not erased prejudice or eliminated conflict, but it had softened the ground. The colonists had learned, through trial and error, that people of varied faiths could form communities where respect and negotiation took the place of force. Whether they realized it or not, these lessons would transfer to the political realm, where differences in region, class, and interest would need to be reconciled for the colonies to form a united front. They had not always been successful in achieving religious harmony, but the very process of managing religious difference had accustomed them to the idea that a political union might also be forged without insisting that everyone think alike. As resentment toward British interference solidified, sermons in pulpits increasingly connected religious and civil liberty. Clergy, now often from denominations that had once been marginalized, spoke of a covenant not only between God and believers, but between rulers and the ruled. Should the ruler fail to protect the people's rights, should he instead impose unjust laws or corrupt practices, the people had a moral duty to resist. Such messages resonated powerfully among those who had seen that authority, including religious authority, could be abused and that moral law stood higher than any human institution. This convergence of religious sentiment and political theory strengthened the colonists' confidence that breaking away from Britain could be justified on both spiritual and rational grounds. By the time the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the colonies were more than just 13 separate communities. They were a patchwork of religious and ethnic groups who had spent decades adapting to the challenges of living side by side. They were a people who had learned, however imperfectly, that freedom could mean trusting individuals and communities to find their own paths rather than forcing them onto a single road. In this environment, the idea of self-governance, of a republic built not on a single church or a single creed, but on the principle that people should be free to worship and think as they pleased, began to feel less like a dangerous experiment and more like a moral imperative. Thus, the quiet work of religious pluralism helped prepare the soil for the revolutionary seeds of liberty and independence. From the earliest days of English settlement on the North American coast, religion had been at once a unifying force and a source of fracture. Settlers embarked on their journeys across the Atlantic with visions of lands where they might worship freely and live according to their convictions, unburdened by the state churches and religious wars of Europe. Yet the reality they encountered was far more complex and fraught. The colonies became a meeting ground of various Christian denominations, and in time other faiths as well. Out of that mixture arose a puzzle with no simple solution. How could these different traditions inhabit the same space without tearing it apart? The question persisted for more than a century, and the quest for answers transformed American religious life. At first, the ideal of harmony proved elusive. Old loyalties and fears carried across the ocean. Puritans tried to maintain enclaves of pristine piety, only to find themselves confronted by Quakers, Baptists, and other dissenters who challenged their assumptions. Catholics, scarce and often mistrusted, sought refuge in Maryland, hoping to build a community in which they could practice their rituals without harassment. Jewish settlers brought a new dimension to the religious landscape, and a wide array of Protestant sects arrived from continental Europe. Drawn to colonies like Pennsylvania, where pluralism was, if not fully embraced, at least tolerated, conflicts broke out and tensions simmered. People were fined, jailed, beaten, and sometimes even executed for their beliefs. But over time, direct persecution became less common. If the colonies did not fully accept all faiths, they at least learned the cost and futility of trying to enforce uniformity by force. In the 17th century, the prevailing belief had been that religious unity was indispensable to social order. By the 18th, the colonies had begun to suspect that this was not entirely true. Small experiments, like the Quaker-led model in Pennsylvania, showed that commercial prosperity, stable governance, and relative peace did not necessarily depend on compelling everyone to worship the same way. The presence of multiple denominations coexisting, sometimes awkwardly and often grudgingly, suggested that variety could be managed rather than uprooted. Religious leaders who once viewed difference as a threat found themselves reconsidering their positions, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, changing demographics, and practical experiences of living side by side with people who prayed differently. These incremental shifts in attitude and practice amounted to something transformative by the time the colonies approached the era of revolution. Although no single document or moment signaled a sudden conversion to the principle of full religious freedom, many colonists had developed a sense that faith could neither be coerced nor successfully confined by legal codes. The struggle to incorporate Catholics, Quakers, Anabaptists, Jews, Lutherans, Huguenots, and others into colonial life had yielded an implicit lesson. Diversity did not automatically invite chaos. Slowly, the idea gained traction that the conscience was not the proper arena for government control, that religious conviction, if genuine, must be freely chosen, and that, in a flourishing community, multiple paths to the divine might exist without summoning divine wrath. This gradual change in thinking provided intellectual scaffolding that the founders and their contemporaries would later use when constructing a new nation. By the time debates over independence gathered momentum, the colonies had developed a political vocabulary rich in the language of rights, liberties, and social contracts. The notion that government should serve rather than subjugate its people overlapped neatly with the evolving belief that no civil authority should dictate how people worship. In essence, the colonies had been practicing the coexistence of multiple religious traditions for generations. Often this was not by choice, and certainly not always gracefully, but it fostered a certain familiarity with difference. This familiarity, in turn, made it easier to envision a political union that allowed for variety not only in religious matters, but in political opinion as well. When the Revolution finally arrived, and eventually, when the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights were forged, the seeds planted by centuries of religious pluralism began to bear fruit. The disestablishment of state churches and the legal protection of religious liberty owed much to the hard-won lessons of the colonial period. Having tested various methods, ranging from repressive laws to cautious tolerance, the former colonists found a middle path that could accommodate the diversity that had become an undeniable feature of American life. Religious liberty was never perfect or complete. Prejudice, suspicion, and even violence would continue to erupt at times. But a new norm had emerged, one in which the freedom to believe or not believe stood as a guiding principle rather than an afterthought. In reflecting on these centuries of struggle, it is clear that American religious freedom was not gifted by a single enlightened leader or discovered in a solitary text. Rather, it emerged from a process of trial and error, conflict and accommodation, thought and debate. Every marginal faith that set down roots, every argument that challenged state coercion, every legal decision that granted partial relief to dissenters, all of these cumulatively shaped the idea that religious difference did not have to be a weakness. Instead, it could be a strength that, in its own quiet way, prepared Americans to embrace pluralism as part of their identity. This legacy of gradual, often painful progress offers a final reflection, that what would one day be hailed as a fundamental right began, fittingly enough, as a messy, evolving effort to make room for everyone's conviction and conscience.